I'm 79 years old now, and for nearly 2 decades I've lived by myself in a quiet little house at the end of a narrow street. People often look at me with a kind of soft concern in their eyes, the kind that comes before they ask a question they think might hurt. They ask if I feel lonely, if the silence ever becomes too much, if I wish there were more voices filling these rooms. I understand why they ask. I used to think the same way when I was younger. I used to believe that being alone meant something was missing, that it was a sign of loss, of emptiness, of something gone wrong. But what I've come to understand, what took me almost a lifetime to learn, is that being alone is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something most people never take the time to discover. My name is Eleanor, and for most of my life, I was never alone. I was a school librarian for over 35 years, surrounded by children, teachers, conversations, responsibilities. At home, there was always someone who needed something, a husband who expected dinner at a certain time, children who needed help with homework, relatives who called, neighbors who stopped by. My days were full, my schedule predictable, my role clearly defined. I knew exactly who I was supposed to be in every situation, and I played that role well. I thought that was what life was about, fitting into the spaces created for you, meeting expectations, keeping everything running smoothly. But somewhere in all of that, I never really met myself. Not properly, not honestly. I knew what others needed from me, but I didn't know what I needed from myself. And the truth is, I never thought to ask. When I was young, I believed that happiness came from being needed. I thought the more people depended on me, the more valuable my life would be. So I made myself available, always. I said yes, even when I wanted to say no. I filled my days with obligations because I thought that was what a good woman did. A good wife, a good mother, a good person. I didn't question it. None of us did. We were taught to build our lives around others, to measure our worth by how much we gave away. It wasn't until much later, long after my husband passed and my children had built lives of their own, that I found myself in a house that had gone quiet. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. I remember walking from room to room, unsure of what to do with all that empty space. There were no schedules to follow, no one waiting for me to do anything. For the first time in decades, there was no one telling me, directly or indirectly, who I needed to be, and I didn't know who I was without that. In those early months, I tried to fill the silence. I kept the radio on, left the television playing even when I wasn't watching. I called people more often than I needed to, just to hear another voice. I thought that was what I was supposed to do, fight the quiet, resist it, because silence to me had always meant something was wrong. But one morning, something changed. It was a small moment, nothing dramatic. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, and the house was completely still. No background noise, no distractions. Just me, the light coming through the glass, and the faint sound of birds outside. And instead of feeling uncomfortable, I felt calm. Not lonely, not empty, just calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. That was the first time I realized that maybe the silence wasn't something to escape from. Maybe it was something I needed to listen to. As the days went on, I started noticing things about myself that had always been there but had never had the space to surface. I realized I preferred quiet mornings to busy afternoons. I noticed that I thought more clearly when I walked alone, without conversation filling every moment. I discovered that I didn't actually enjoy many of the social obligations I had spent years maintaining. I had convinced myself I did because it was expected, because everyone around me seemed to accept it as normal. But alone, with no one to perform for, I began to see the difference between what I truly enjoyed and what I had simply learned to tolerate. I remember thinking about all the dinner gatherings I used to host, the effort I put into making everything perfect, the careful attention to details that I believed mattered so much. And when I stopped doing those things, I expected to miss them. I thought I would feel a gap, a sense of something lost, but I didn't, not even a little. What I felt instead was relief, a quiet kind of freedom I hadn't known I was allowed to have. That realization stayed with me. It made me question other parts of my life, other habits, other choices. How many things had I done simply because I thought I should? How many parts of myself had I shaped to fit expectations that were never truly mine? Spending time alone gave me the space to ask those questions honestly. And more importantly, it gave me the space to answer them without judgment. I began to understand that identity is not something fixed, not something handed to you by the roles you play. It is something that reveals itself slowly, in the absence of noise, in the moments when no one else is watching. And for the first time in my life, I had enough quiet to notice it. There's a kind of clarity that comes from solitude, a sharpness of awareness that you cannot find in a crowded life. When you are constantly surrounded by others, your attention is always divided. You are listening, responding, adjusting, performing in small ways you don't even realize. But when you are alone, truly alone, all of that falls away. What remains is simple, but it is also profound. You begin to see yourself not as a collection of roles, but as a person with preferences, thoughts, and feelings that exist independently of anyone else's expectations. I learned, for example, that I enjoy reading in complete silence without music in the background, that I like my meals simple, not elaborate, that I find more joy in a quiet afternoon with a book than in a crowded room full of conversation. These may seem like small discoveries, but they are not small at all. They are the building blocks of a life that feels honest. A friend of mine, Margaret, who is a few years younger than me, once told me something that stayed with me. She said she didn't realize she loved gardening until she was in her 70s, until she had time to spend entire mornings outside without interruption. Now her backyard is filled with plants she's grown herself, each one carefully tended, each one a reflection of time she finally had for herself. She didn't suddenly become a different person. She simply became more fully who she had always been. That is what solitude offers, not loneliness, but discovery. And yet, so many people are afraid of it. They think that being alone means they are missing out, that something essential is absent from their lives. But what I've learned is that sometimes what feels like absence is actually space, space to breathe, to think, to notice, to understand. For most of my life, I never had that space. I moved from one responsibility to another, from one expectation to the next, without ever stopping long enough to ask if any of it truly belonged to me. And I don't regret those years. They were part of my life, part of what brought me here. But I do see them differently now. I see how much of myself was shaped by habit, by routine, by the quiet pressure of doing what was expected. And I see how much of myself remained hidden beneath all of that, waiting patiently for a moment of stillness. That moment didn't come quickly. It didn't arrive in some grand, life changing instant. It came slowly, quietly, in small pieces, in mornings spent alone, in afternoons without plans, in evenings where the only sound was the ticking of a clock and the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. And in that stillness, I began to understand something I wish I had known much earlier. Being alone is not something to fear, it is something to learn. At first, I didn't trust that feeling. It seemed too simple, too quiet to be something meaningful. For so many years, I had been taught, directly and indirectly, that a full life was a busy life, that happiness made noise, that meaning came from being surrounded by people who needed you. So when I found myself beginning to enjoy the stillness, a part of me questioned it. I wondered if I was just getting used to it, if it was something like resignation rather than choice. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized it wasn't resignation at all. It was clarity. I started to notice how often I used to ask for permission without even realizing it, not out loud, but quietly inside my own thoughts. Every decision, no matter how small, seemed to pass through some invisible filter. I would think about what others might say, what they might expect, whether it was appropriate, whether it made sense for someone like me. It had become such a habit that I didn't even recognize it as hesitation. I thought it was normal. Even after I began living alone, that habit stayed with me for a while. I would stand in a shop holding something I wanted and feel that familiar pause. Do I really need this? Is this sensible? Is this something I should be doing? And then one afternoon, I caught myself doing it over something so small it almost made me laugh. I was deciding whether to buy a bright blue armchair for my living room. It was bold, far more colorful than anything I had ever chosen before. The kind of thing I would have dismissed immediately years ago because it didn't fit the image I had of myself. I stood there for several minutes holding onto the edge of that chair, going through all the usual thoughts. And then something shifted. A very simple thought came to me, one that felt almost unfamiliar. No one else lives here. No one else has to like it. If I like it, that is enough. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but for me it was a revelation. I bought the chair. It sits by my window now, catching the morning light, and every time I look at it, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, not because it's particularly beautiful, but because I chose it without asking anyone else, without measuring it against anyone else's expectations. That was the beginning of something larger. I started making other decisions the same way, small ones at first. Eating when I felt hungry instead of at a fixed time. Rearranging the furniture simply because I wanted a different view. Taking walks at odd hours, early in the morning or late in the evening, just because it felt right. None of these things would have seemed important before, but together they changed the way my days felt. There is a certain freedom in no longer waiting for approval. It doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, decision by decision, until one day you realize that your life is no longer shaped by what you think you should do, but by what you actually want to do. And that difference, though subtle, is profound. I think about my younger years and how much of my energy went into maintaining a version of myself that others expected. I don't blame anyone for it. That was simply the way things were. But I can see now how much of my own voice was quieted by that constant need to align with expectations. Living alone gave that voice space to grow louder, clearer, more confident. Another thing that changed, though it took me longer to understand, was my relationship with silence. For most of my life, silence felt uncomfortable. It carried a kind of weight, as if it were pointing out something missing. I filled it without thinking, with conversation, with noise, with anything that would make it disappear. When I first found myself alone, that discomfort became even more noticeable. There were moments when the quiet felt almost too loud, if that makes any sense. My thoughts seemed sharper, more present, and I wasn't used to sitting with them without distraction. I remember one evening in particular, sitting in my living room after sunset, with no lights on, just the faint glow coming through the curtains. The house was completely still, and I felt a kind of restlessness I couldn't quite explain. My first instinct was to turn on the television, to break that silence the way I always had. But for some reason, I didn't. I stayed where I was. I let the quiet remain. And after a while, something unexpected happened. The restlessness faded. My thoughts slowed down. The silence stopped feeling heavy and started feeling spacious. It's difficult to describe exactly, but it was as if the quiet wasn't empty at all. It was full, just not in the way I was used to. It held small details I had never noticed before. The sound of the clock ticking, the faint rustle of leaves outside, even the rhythm of my own breathing became something I could hear, something I could pay attention to. From that point on, I began to see silence differently. It was no longer something to avoid. It became something I returned to. I started spending time each day just sitting, not doing anything in particular, not reading, not listening to anything, just being present in that quiet space. And in those moments, I began to remember things I hadn't thought about in years. Memories would surface gently, without effort. Small, ordinary moments from long ago. The way my father used to clear his throat before speaking. The smell of old books in the library where I worked. The sound of my children laughing in the next room when they were young. These weren't grand, important memories, but they felt meaningful in a way I hadn't experienced before. I realized that silence gives those memories room to return. When your life is constantly filled with noise, there is no space for reflection. Everything moves too quickly. But in quiet, time seems to slow down just enough for you to notice what has always been there. There is also a kind of honesty that comes with silence. Without distractions, without the constant input of other voices, you are left with your own thoughts in their purest form. At first, that can be uncomfortable. You may notice things you've been avoiding, feelings you haven't fully acknowledged. But if you stay with it, if you don't run from it, that discomfort turns into understanding. I began to understand myself in ways I never had before, not in a dramatic, life-altering sense, but in small, steady realizations. I noticed patterns in my thinking, habits in my reactions, quiet preferences I had ignored for years, and instead of judging them, I simply observed them. That shift, from reacting to observing, changed something fundamental in me. It gave me a sense of steadiness, a kind of inner balance that doesn't depend on what is happening around me. When you are comfortable in silence, you are not easily shaken by noise. Along with that came a growing sense of capability. Living alone meant that there were things I had to handle myself, things I had once relied on others to manage. At first, this felt daunting. I wasn't used to dealing with certain practical matters on my own, but necessity has a way of teaching you quickly. I remember the first time something broke in the house after I was on my own. It was a small thing, a loose cabinet door that wouldn't stay closed. In the past, I would have waited for someone else to fix it. It would have remained slightly crooked for days, maybe weeks, until someone came by and took care of it. But that day, I decided to try fixing it myself. It wasn't complicated, but it wasn't something I had ever done before. I found a screwdriver, examined the hinges, and slowly figured out what needed to be adjusted. It took longer than it probably should have, and the result wasn't perfect, but when I stepped back and looked at it, I felt something I hadn't expected, not pride exactly, but a quiet confidence. That small moment stayed with me. It showed me that I was capable of more than I had assumed. And once you begin to see yourself that way, it changes how you approach everything else. You stop waiting for someone else to solve your problems. You start trying, even if you're not sure you'll succeed. Over time, those small acts of independence build into something larger. You begin to trust yourself more. You realize that you can handle things, that you are not as dependent as you once believed. And that realization brings a kind of strength that is very different from the strength that comes from being supported by others. It is quieter, less visible, but in many ways more lasting. That quiet strength changes the way you move through the world, even in the smallest moments. You stop seeing yourself as someone who is waiting for life to happen, and you begin to understand that life is already happening, right here, in the ordinary rhythm of your days. I didn't notice that shift all at once. It came gradually, the way most real changes do, almost without announcement. Somewhere along the way, I began to create things again, not because I had to, not because anyone expected it, but simply because I wanted to. It started with something small. One morning, I found an old notebook in a drawer, one I must have bought years earlier and never used. The pages were still clean, untouched, as if they had been waiting for the right moment. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee and opened it, not really knowing what I intended to write. At first, the words came slowly. I wrote about the weather, about the way the light fell across the floor, about nothing in particular. It wasn't impressive, not something I would have shown anyone. But there was something satisfying about it, about putting thoughts into words without worrying about whether they were good or useful or meaningful to anyone else. It was just an act of expression, simple and private. That small habit grew. I began writing more often, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening when the house was quiet and the day had settled. I wrote about memories, about things I had never taken the time to reflect on before. Some of it made sense, some of it didn't, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was mine. I think creativity changes as you grow older. When you are young, there is often a desire to be seen, to be recognized, to be validated by others. There is nothing wrong with that. It is part of finding your place in the world. But later in life, especially when you are comfortable being alone, that need begins to fade. You no longer create for approval. You create because the act itself feels meaningful. A neighbor of mine, Thomas, who used to work as a mechanic, spends his afternoons building small wooden boxes in his garage. He doesn't sell them, doesn't even show them to many people. He just enjoys the process, the careful measuring, the steady rhythm of his hands working with the wood. When I asked him once why he spends so much time on something so simple, he smiled and said, "Because I can." That answer stayed with me. Because I can. It sounds almost too simple, but there is a kind of freedom in it that is hard to explain. When you are no longer trying to prove anything, when you are not measuring your actions against anyone else's expectations, you are free to explore, to try, to fail without consequence. I started cooking differently too. For most of my life, cooking was a task, something tied to responsibility, to feeding others, to meeting expectations. There were rules to follow, routines to maintain. But now it feels different. I try things I've never tried before, not because I need to, but because I'm curious. Sometimes it turns out well, sometimes it doesn't, but the outcome matters less than the experience. There is a kind of playfulness that returns when you allow yourself that freedom. You begin to approach life with a lighter touch, less concerned with getting everything right, more interested in simply experiencing it. And perhaps the most surprising thing I've learned is that being alone has not made me distant from people. If anything, it has deepened my connections. I see fewer people now than I used to, but the time I spend with them feels more real, more present. When I sit with a friend, I am fully there. I am not distracted, not thinking about the next thing I need to do, not dividing my attention between multiple obligations. I listen more carefully. I notice things I might have missed before. Small changes in tone, pauses in conversation, the things that are not said as much as the things that are. There is a woman who lives a few houses down from me. Her name is Clara. She doesn't attend many social gatherings, and people often assume she is distant or uninterested. But the few times I have sat with her, just the two of us, I have found her to be deeply attentive, thoughtful in a way that is rare. She remembers details from conversations months ago, asks questions that show she has been paying attention in a way most people don't. It made me realize that solitude doesn't make you less social, it makes you more selective. You begin to understand the difference between being surrounded by people and truly connecting with them. You start to value depth over frequency, presence over proximity. My relationship with my children has changed in a similar way. There was a time, not long after I began living alone, when I felt the urge to reach out to them constantly. I told myself it was because I missed them, and that was true to some extent. But there was also a part of me that was trying to fill the silence, to replace it with something familiar. Over time, as I grew more comfortable with my own company, that need softened. I stopped calling as often, not because I cared less, but because I no longer needed that constant reassurance. And something interesting happened. They began to reach out more. Our conversations became lighter, more genuine. There was no underlying pressure, no unspoken expectation. When we spoke, it was because we wanted to, not because we felt obligated to, and that made all the difference. I've come to understand that when you are at peace with yourself, your relationships change naturally. You no longer approach them from a place of need. You approach them from a place of choice. And that shift, though subtle, transforms the quality of every interaction.